The gleaming interior of the first-class cabin sparkled under the warm lighting as passengers filed in for the cross-country flight from Los Angeles to New York. Among them was basketball legend Shaquille O'Neal, dressed casually in a tailored gray suit that somehow managed to fit his 7 feet 1 inch frame. Despite his towering presence, Shaq moved with the gentle grace that had endeared him to millions throughout his career. As he made his way to his seat, a few fellow passengers smiled in recognition, while others pretended not to notice, the typical, respectful response he'd grown used to over the years. Shaq had just finished a long day of business meetings and was looking forward to a quiet flight where he could catch up on some rest. The peace was short-lived. A well-dressed businessman in his 50s, clutching a leather briefcase and sporting an expensive watch, stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Shaq settling into his seat. The man's face contorted into an expression of disbelief and barely concealed disdain. "There must be some mistake," he announced loudly, catching the attention of nearby passengers. "How is this appropriate?" His eyes darted between Shaq and the flight attendant who was helping another passenger stow their luggage. Shaq had encountered similar situations before. Years of experience in the public eye had taught him that sometimes the best response was no response at all. He simply continued organizing his belongings, maintaining his composure as the businessman's words hung in the air. The flight attendant, a professional with over 15 years of experience, approached with a warm smile. "Is there something I can help you with, sir?" she asked the businessman, though she had clearly heard his comment. "Yes, there is," the man replied, lowering his voice but not enough to prevent others from hearing. "I paid a premium for first class. I don't understand why." He gestured vaguely in Shaq's direction, leaving the rest of his discriminatory implication unspoken. The cabin grew quiet. Other passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, some shaking their heads in disapproval at the businessman's behavior. A young tech entrepreneur sitting across the aisle seemed to be recording the interaction discreetly on his phone. It was at this moment that Shaq did something unexpected. He stood up, his full height making the businessman take an involuntary step back. But instead of showing anger, Shaq's face broke into his characteristic warm smile, the same one that had lit up countless basketball courts and television screens. "Sir," Shaq said, his voice carrying the same friendly tone he used when talking to young fans, "I understand you're concerned about your flight experience. Would you like to sit next to me? I'd love to hear about your business ventures, and I might even share some investment tips I've learned over the years." The businessman's face flushed red, caught off guard by this display of grace. Several passengers who had been holding their breath now watched in amazement as Shaq extended his hand in friendship. The flight attendant, still maintaining her professional demeanor, added, "Mr. O'Neal is one of our most valued frequent flyers. He's actually helped our airline develop programs for passengers of all sizes to travel comfortably." The businessman stood frozen, his earlier bravado evaporating under the weight of Shaq's kindness and the disapproving stares of other passengers. A child from a few rows back called out, "Mom, isn't that the guy from those funny commercials?" This broke the tension, and several passengers chuckled. Shaq turned and waved at the young fan, his smile growing even wider. "That's right, little man. Those commercials help me invest in communities and education programs." The businessman, now visibly uncomfortable, mumbled something about a misunderstanding and quickly took his assigned seat, which, as fate would have it, was indeed next to Shaq. As he sat down, Shaq noticed the man's hands trembling slightly as he attempted to buckle his seatbelt. Instead of ignoring him, Shaq engaged in light conversation about the Lakers' latest season, purposely steering clear of any mention of the earlier incident. Other passengers watched in amazement as the basketball legend demonstrated the art of turning an adversary into a potential friend. As the flight progressed, something remarkable happened. The businessman's rigid posture gradually relaxed. By the time the drink service came around, he and Shaq were engaged in a genuine conversation about business innovation and community investment, topics they both knew well. Other passengers occasionally glanced their way, witnessing a masterclass in handling prejudice with dignity. The young tech entrepreneur who had recorded the initial confrontation posted a thoughtful message about the incident on social media, praising not just Shaq's response but the larger lesson it taught about handling difficult situations with grace. When the plane began its descent into New York, the businessman turned to Shaq with visible remorse in his eyes. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I made assumptions that were wrong and unfair." Shaq simply nodded, understanding that sometimes the biggest victories come not from defeating others, but from helping them see their own potential for change. As passengers began gathering their belongings, several people stopped to shake Shaq's hand, not because of his basketball fame, but because they had witnessed something far more valuable, a lesson in human dignity. The flight attendant, who had watched the entire interaction unfold, later shared with her colleagues how this incident reminded her why she loved her job. Sometimes, at 35,000 feet, people could rise above their prejudices and find common ground. The video of Shaq's graceful handling of the first-class incident spread across social media platforms like wildfire. The young tech entrepreneur who captured the moment had initially hesitated to share it, but after witnessing the transformation that took place during the flight, he felt the world needed to see this masterclass in human dignity. Within hours of landing at JFK, the clip had already garnered millions of views. Comments poured in from around the globe, with people sharing their own experiences of facing prejudice and discussing how Shaq's response had given them a new perspective on handling difficult situations. Back at the terminal, as passengers departed, something unexpected happened. The businessman, who had been quietly reflective during the latter part of the flight, approached Shaq near the baggage claim area. His demeanor had completely changed from the confrontational figure of a few hours ago. "Mr. O'Neill," he called out, his voice carrying a hint of nervousness. "Could I have a moment of your time?" Shaq turned, his warm smile still present, and nodded. The businessman pulled out a business card and handed it to Shaq. "I run several community development projects in underprivileged neighborhoods," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "But today made me realize I've been missing something crucial in my approach. Would you consider visiting one of our youth centers? The kids there, they need to hear your message about dignity and grace." Shaq listened intently, noting how the man's hands trembled slightly as he spoke, not from fear this time, but from genuine emotion. The basketball legend had seen many transformations throughout his career, but few as profound as this one. "You know," Shaq replied, pocketing the business card, "sometimes the biggest assists don't happen on the basketball court. I'd be happy to visit your center." He paused, then added with his characteristic humor, "Just make sure the doorways are tall enough." The light moment they shared was captured by another passenger, and this photo too began circulating online, a powerful follow-up to the earlier video. It showed two men, initially divided by prejudice, now sharing a genuine moment of connection. Meanwhile, the flight attendant who had witnessed the entire incident had submitted a detailed report to her supervisors. Within days, the airline's training department reached out to Shaq with an unusual request. They wanted to develop a new customer service training module based on how he handled the situation. The story continued to ripple outward. A local news station picked up the viral video and decided to dig deeper. They discovered that the businessman's youth centers primarily served communities of color, adding another layer of complexity to his initial behavior on the plane. In an anonymous interview, he admitted that his prejudiced reaction had forced him to confront his own unconscious biases. Despite his professional work, sometimes the best way to be big is to be bigger than the moment calls for. The youth center buzzed with excitement as Shaq spent time with each group of young people. One teenager, who stood at 6 feet 4 inches and often felt self-conscious about his height, found himself opening up to the basketball legend about the challenges he faced. "People always expect me to play basketball," the young man confided, slouching slightly as he spoke. "But I love computer programming. Sometimes I try to make myself smaller so people won't keep pushing me toward sports." Shaq listened thoughtfully before sharing his own experience. "You know what's funny?" he said, leaning back in a chair that seemed comically small beneath his frame. "People tried to put me in a box too. They thought because I was tall and played basketball, I couldn't be smart or business savvy. But I went back to school, got my doctorate, and now I own businesses. Your height doesn't define your dreams." The teenager's eyes lit up. Other young people gathered around as Shaq continued, "The same way I handled that situation on the plane, you can handle people's expectations. Stand tall, not just in height, but in who you are. Being different isn't a weakness, it's your superpower." Meanwhile, the businessman who had caused the initial confrontation was having profound conversations with his staff. In a meeting room adjacent to the main activity area, he opened up to his team about his behavior on the plane. "I've spent years funding programs to help communities," he admitted, his voice carrying a note of hard-won understanding. "But writing checks is different from confronting your own biases. That day on the plane, I wasn't just wrong, I was everything I claimed to be fighting against." His honesty sparked a deep discussion among the staff about their own experiences with prejudice, both as victims and unconscious perpetrators. One team member shared how she had faced similar treatment on business flights, but had never felt empowered to respond as gracefully as Shaq had. The conversation was interrupted by sounds of laughter from the main room. Shaq had organized an impromptu workshop where kids were role-playing different scenarios of handling prejudice with dignity. The businessman watched through the doorway, amazed at how the basketball star had transformed a painful incident into a teaching moment. Back at the airline's corporate headquarters, the training department was reviewing footage from various passenger interactions. The flight attendant who had witnessed Shaq's handling of the situation was now consulting with them, helping develop scenarios for their new training program. What made Mr. O'Neill's response so effective, she explained to a room full of trainers, was that he didn't just defuse the situation, he transformed it. He gave the other person a chance to become better. The airline's new training module, titled Rising Above, Transforming Conflict into Connection, quickly gained attention throughout the industry. Other airlines began reaching out, interested in implementing similar programs. The focus shifted from merely managing difficult passengers to creating opportunities for human connection. The story continued to resonate on social media, but in an unexpected way. People began sharing their own first-class lesson stories, moments when they chose to respond to prejudice with dignity rather than anger. The hashtag first-class lesson started trending, filled with stories of transformation and growth. A teacher in Chicago shared how she used the video in her classroom to discuss conflict resolution. "My students were fascinated by how changing your response can change the entire situation," she wrote. "We've seen a remarkable decrease in confrontational behavior since implementing these lessons." The young tech entrepreneur who recorded the original video found himself becoming an unexpected advocate for positive social media use. In a viral blog post, he reflected on his decision to share the video. "I could have posted just the confrontation," he wrote. "That would have gotten views too. But by showing the entire interaction, the conflict, the response, and the transformation, we gave people something more valuable than viral content. We gave them a blueprint for change." As weeks passed, the businessman's youth centers saw an increase in enrollment. Parents were drawn to the new program focusing on dignity and conflict resolution. The center began offering workshops called Standing Tall in Every Situation, inspired by Shaq's visit and message. The teenager interested in programming started a coding club at the center, proudly standing at his full height as he taught other kids the basics of computer science. The businessman made sure the club had all the resources it needed, seeing it as a testament to the change he was committed to supporting. Shaq's influence continued to ripple outward. Professional sports teams began incorporating similar training into their public relations programs, teaching athletes how to handle potentially volatile situations with grace. The NBA specifically cited the airplane incident in their rookie orientation programs. During a speaking engagement at a business conference, Shaq reflected on the incident's lasting impact. "Success isn't just about winning," he told the audience. "It's about lifting others up, even when they try to bring you down. That's the real victory." The flight attendant who witnessed the original incident received a promotion to help lead the airline's new training initiatives. In her first presentation to a group of new hires, she shared something she had learned from that day. "We're not just in the transportation business," she said. "We're in the human business. Every interaction is an opportunity to help someone rise above their limitations, including our own." The story had become more than just a viral moment or a feel-good narrative. It had evolved into a movement about choosing dignity over division, understanding over confrontation, and growth over grievance. In boardrooms, classrooms, and community centers across the country, people were learning that sometimes the biggest person in the room isn't the one who stands tallest, but the one who lifts others up. 6 months after the flight that changed multiple lives, the impact of Shaq's response to prejudice continued to evolve in unexpected ways. The story had moved beyond viral sensation to become a catalyst for genuine social change. One morning, the businessman sat in his office, reviewing a stack of letters from parents whose children attended his youth centers. Each letter told a story of transformation. One mother wrote about how her shy daughter had found her voice after learning about standing up to prejudice with dignity. Another described how her son had defused a tense situation at school using the techniques he'd learned from the center's new conflict resolution program. As he read through the letters, his eyes fell on a framed photo on his desk, a picture from Shaq's visit to the center. In it, the basketball legend was crouching down to high-five a young girl who barely reached his knee. The businessman often found himself staring at this photo, remembering how his own prejudices had nearly prevented such moments from happening. The youth center's coding club, started by the tall teenager who loved programming, had grown into something remarkable. Local tech companies began offering internships to the students, recognizing that talent comes in all shapes and sizes. The teenager, no longer slouching, had become a mentor to younger kids who felt different or out of place. "Being tall made me stand out," he told a group of new club members, "but Dr. O'Neill taught me that standing out isn't a burden, it's an opportunity to show others how to rise above expectations." The airline industry had undergone its own transformation. The training program inspired by Shaq's actions had been implemented by major carriers across the country. Flight attendants reported a significant decrease in confrontational incidents, and passenger satisfaction scores were reaching new heights. The flight attendant who witnessed the original incident had become a sought-after speaker at industry conferences. She shared how one moment of choosing dignity over confrontation could ripple outward in countless ways. "We had a situation last week," she told a packed audience at an aviation conference. A passenger was getting upset about sitting next to someone different from them. Instead of escalating the situation, our crew member remembered the first-class lesson. She created a moment of connection, and by the end of the flight, those two passengers were exchanging contact information. The young tech entrepreneur's video had sparked a broader conversation about responsible social media use. His platform for sharing transformative moments had grown into a movement, with people around the world submitting stories of choosing dignity over discord. One story came from a high school basketball coach who had used Shaq's example to teach his team about handling prejudice during away games. "We were facing some tough crowd behavior," the coach shared. "Instead of retaliating, our players remembered the first-class lesson. They played with dignity, and by the end of the game, they had won over the opposing crowd." Shaq himself had incorporated the incident into his business lectures at universities. He used it to teach future leaders about the power of transforming negative situations into opportunities for growth. During one such lecture, a student asked why he hadn't simply confronted the businessman about his prejudice. Shaq's response resonated throughout the auditorium. "In life, like in basketball, you can try to block every shot that comes your way, or you can catch it and turn it into an assist. The real victory isn't in proving someone wrong, it's in helping them find a better way to be right. The businessman had taken this lesson to heart. He completely restructured his company's hiring practices, eliminating unconscious bias in their recruitment process. His organization became known for its inclusive culture, and other companies began studying their methods. One day, he received an unexpected call. Another CEO had faced a similar situation on a flight and, remembering the viral video, had chosen to respond with dignity rather than anger. "Your story," the CEO told him, "taught me that it's never too late to change the narrative. Thank you for being brave enough to share your transformation." The ripple effects continued in surprising ways. A Hollywood producer approached Shaq about turning the story into a documentary about transformative moments in people's lives. Instead of focusing solely on the flight incident, the documentary would explore how small choices to respond with dignity could create lasting change. The airline created a scholarship program for students studying conflict resolution and human relations. They named it the First Class Character Scholarship, and the first recipient was a young woman who had started a peer mediation program at her inner-city high school. During the scholarship ceremony, she shared her own story. "I used to think that standing up for yourself meant standing against others. But this story taught me that true strength lies in standing up for your dignity while helping others find theirs." The businessman's youth centers had become a model for similar programs across the country. Other organizations sought their guidance in implementing programs that combine practical skills with lessons about dignity and personal growth. The coding club expanded into multiple locations, and the tall teenage programmer who started it all was featured in a national magazine. In the article, he shared how Shaq's example had helped him embrace his uniqueness. "Dr. O'Neill showed me that our differences aren't obstacles, they're opportunities to show others a different way of seeing the world." 1 year after the flight, the businessman and Shaq collaborated on a leadership summit focused on transforming workplace culture. The event brought together executives, educators, and community leaders to discuss how principles of dignity and understanding could reshape organizational behavior. During their joint presentation, the businessman turned to Shaq and said something that captured the essence of their shared journey: "You had every right to put me in my place that day on the plane. Instead, you helped me find a better place to be." The summit concluded with the announcement of a new initiative, a nationwide program to bring dignity-based conflict resolution training to schools, businesses, and community organizations. The program would be funded by a coalition of companies who had been inspired by the viral story and its lasting impact. 18 months after the transformative flight, the story's impact had crossed international borders. A Japanese airline executive who had seen the viral video implemented a similar training program for their staff, adapting the principles to fit their cultural context. The concept of responding to prejudice with dignity resonated deeply with their philosophy of service and respect. During a global aviation summit in Dubai, airline representatives from different countries shared how they had incorporated the first-class lesson into their own cultural frameworks. A flight attendant from Singapore Airlines described how they had adapted the training to address cultural sensitivity specific to their region. "What's remarkable," she explained to her colleagues, "is how universal this message is. Whether you're flying over the Pacific or the Atlantic, dignity speaks every language." Back in the United States, the tall teenager who had started the coding club was now preparing for college. He had received multiple scholarship offers, including one from a prestigious tech company that had heard his story through the youth center's network. During his admission interviews, he spoke about how meeting Shaq had changed his perspective on standing out. "I used to try to shrink myself to fit in," he told the admission panel. "Now I understand that my height isn't just a physical attribute, it's a reminder to stand tall in who I am, just like Dr. O'Neill taught us." The businessman's transformation had caught the attention of corporate leadership experts. He was invited to give a TED Talk about his journey from prejudice to purpose. As he stood on the famous red carpet, he shared a detail he had never spoken about publicly before. "The suit I wore on that flight," he revealed, hangs in my office now. Not as a reminder of my shame, but as a symbol of how far we can all grow when someone shows us a better way. Every morning, I look at it and ask myself, how can I help someone else transform today? His talk went viral, adding another layer to the ongoing story. Corporate training programs began incorporating both sides of the narrative, Shaq's response and the businessman's transformation, to demonstrate how dignity can create change from any starting point. The flight attendant who had witnessed the original incident found herself developing specialized training modules for handling prejudice in confined spaces. An airplane at 35,000 feet is a unique environment, she would explain in her sessions. We're all literally in this together, and that makes it the perfect place to learn how to rise above our differences. The youth centers had expanded their impact through a virtual mentoring program, connecting young people from different backgrounds across the country. They used video conferencing to share stories, challenges, and successes in applying the principles they had learned. During one virtual session, a young girl from a rural community shared how she had used the first-class lesson to handle bullying at her school. "I'm the only one in my class who looks like me," she said. "But instead of getting angry at the mean comments, I remembered what Dr. O'Neill did. I invited those same kids to join my study group. Now we're all getting better grades together." The airline scholarship program had grown to include internships in conflict resolution and cultural understanding. One of the scholarship recipients, a college student studying psychology, conducted research on the long-term effects of choosing dignity over confrontation in high-stress situations. Her findings, published in a peer-reviewed journal, showed that responding to prejudice with dignity not only diffused immediate tensions but also created lasting positive changes in both parties' behavior patterns. The study became required reading in several university psychology programs. Shaq's influence continued to grow in unexpected ways. A children's book author created a series about a gentle giant who helped others see beyond their prejudices. Though not officially based on Shaq, the parallels were clear, and the books became popular in elementary school character education programs. The tech entrepreneur who had recorded the original video had developed an app that helped people share and document their own dignity moments. Users could upload short videos of positive interactions that transformed potential conflicts into connections. "We're creating a digital archive of human dignity," he explained in a podcast interview. "Every story shows another way to handle prejudice with grace, building on what Dr. O'Neill showed us that day on the plane." The businessman's company had become known for its innovative approach to corporate social responsibility. They had created a program called Transform Together, which paired executives with community organizations to work on projects promoting understanding and inclusion. During one such project, the businessmen worked alongside a group of high school students to create a public art installation about transformation. The centerpiece was a large mirror surrounded by stories of change, encouraging viewers to reflect on their own potential for growth. The airline industry's approach to handling difficult situations had evolved significantly. Rather than simply training staff to manage conflicts, they now focused on creating opportunities for connection. Other service industries began studying this model, adapting it for hotels, restaurants, and retail environments. A retail chain implemented a program called Shop with Dignity, inspired by the airline's training. When a store manager successfully transformed a potentially racist incident into a moment of understanding, she credited her training based on the first-class lesson. "The customer was making assumptions about one of our employees," she shared in a company newsletter. "Instead of confronting or dismissing them, we engaged them in conversation about our community involvement. By the end of their visit, they had signed up to volunteer at our next community event." The impact reached educational institutions as well. A high school principal in Minnesota implemented a conflict resolution program based on the story's principles. The school saw a significant decrease in disciplinary incidents and an increase in student-led initiatives promoting understanding. During a parent-teacher conference, one mother tearfully shared how her son, who had struggled with anger management, had started using the phrase, "What would Shaq do?" when facing difficult situations. It had become his way of remembering to choose dignity over anger. The story continued to evolve in the digital space. Social media platforms reported that hashtags related to dignity and transformation consistently generated more engagement than those focused on conflict and confrontation. It was a small but significant shift in online culture. A popular podcast dedicated an episode to exploring how the incident had influenced corporate America's approach to diversity and inclusion training. The host noted that what made this story different was its focus on transformation rather than punishment or shame. 2 years after the flight that changed countless lives, the story found its way into academic research. A sociology professor at Stanford University conducted a comprehensive study on what she called the O'Neill effect, the phenomenon of transforming prejudice through dignified responses rather than confrontation. Her research team interviewed hundreds of people who had been influenced by the story. From flight attendants to corporate executives to schoolchildren. One particular case study stood out, a city bus driver who had completely changed how he handled difficult passengers after watching the viral video. "I used to react to every insult," the bus driver shared during his interview. "Now I see each difficult moment as a chance to do what Dr. O'Neill did, to lift someone up instead of shutting them down." Last week, a passenger was being hostile about an elderly woman who was taking too long to board. "Instead of arguing, I shared how that elderly woman volunteers at a local children's hospital. By the end of the ride, the angry passenger was helping her with her groceries." The businessman's youth centers had evolved into full-fledged community transformation hubs. They now offered programs for all ages, from children learning coding to seniors sharing life experiences. The centers became known as places where differences were celebrated rather than merely tolerated. During a community celebration at one of the centers, a grandmother stood up to share her story. "My grandson was being bullied at school for his accent," she said, her voice strong with emotion. "He came to this center and learned about Dr. O'Neill's response on that plane. Now he teaches other kids about his culture during lunch breaks. The same boys who used to mock him are now learning to speak his language." The airline industry's transformation had caught the attention of major business schools. Harvard Business School developed a case study about how one moment of choosing dignity over confrontation had revolutionized customer service training across multiple industries. The flight attendant who witnessed the original incident was invited to lecture at these business schools. She brought a unique perspective on how small moments could create lasting change. "Every interaction is an opportunity," she would tell the students. "We're not just serving drinks or giving safety instructions, we're showing people how to treat each other with dignity at 35,000 feet." The Tech Entrepreneur's app for sharing dignity moments had grown into a global platform for positive change. Users from different countries shared stories of how they transformed potentially negative situations into opportunities for understanding. One story came from a teacher in South Korea who used the app to document her class's journey in welcoming a refugee student. "We watched the video of Dr. O'Neill on the plane and discussed how we could make our new classmate feel welcomed," she wrote. The students created a buddy system, learning phrases in his language and sharing their lunches. What could have been a story of isolation became a lesson in connection. Shaq himself had been moved by how far the story had spread. During a commencement speech at a university, he shared a reflection that captured the essence of what had happened. "Sometimes your biggest moment isn't when you're scoring points or winning championships. Sometimes it's when you choose to help someone else score a victory over their own prejudices." The tall teenager who had started the coding club was now running coding camps during his college breaks. He had created a curriculum that wove lessons about dignity and self-acceptance into technical instruction. "Writing code taught me logic," he told his students, "but Dr. O'Neill taught me how to program my responses to prejudice." The businessman had taken his transformation a step further. He established a foundation dedicated to what he called dignity innovation, finding creative ways to combat prejudice in everyday situations. The foundation provided grants to individuals and organizations developing new approaches to promoting understanding. One grant recipient created a virtual reality program that allowed users to experience situations from different perspectives. The program included a recreation of the flight incident, letting users explore various ways to respond to prejudice. It became a popular training tool in corporate diversity programs. The airline scholarship program had expanded to include a research component. Scholars studied how choosing dignity over confrontation affected both individuals and communities long-term. Their findings suggested that transformed situations created ripple effects that continued for years. A professional sports team psychologist incorporated the story into their player development program. Athletes face all kinds of prejudice and pressure, she explained. Teaching them to respond like Dr. O'Neill did, with dignity rather than defensiveness, has transformed how they handle challenging situations both on and off the court. The impact continued in unexpected places. A prison rehabilitation program used the story to teach inmates about transforming negative interactions. One participant, serving a sentence for assault, wrote a letter to Shaq describing how the lesson had changed his approach to conflict. "I used to think showing strength meant dominating others," he wrote. "Now I understand that true strength is helping others find their dignity, even when they're attacking yours." The business world had begun measuring what they called the dignity dividend, the measurable benefits of implementing dignity-based response training in customer service. Companies reported higher employee satisfaction, better customer retention, and fewer escalated conflicts. During a leadership conference, the businessman shared something he had never revealed before. "The watch I was wearing that day on the plane, the one I kept checking impatiently, is in a display case at our main youth center now. Below it is a simple message: time is precious. Use it to lift others up." The flight attendant who had witnessed everything had started a mentoring program for new airline staff. She taught them that every flight was an opportunity to create what she called altitude attitude, rising above prejudice to find common ground. The amazing thing about that day, she would tell her trainees, wasn't just how Dr. O'Neill handled the situation. It was how he showed all of us that every moment of prejudice carries the seed of transformation. We just have to be brave enough to plant it. 2.5 years after the flight, the story's influence had reached places no one could have predicted. A small town in Minnesota became the first dignity city, implementing programs inspired by Shaq's response across all public services, from police training to parks and recreation. The town's mayor, inspired by how a single moment on a plane had created lasting change, launched an initiative called Small Town, Tall Spirit. The program encouraged residents to document and share their own stories of choosing dignity over confrontation. One such story came from the local diner, where a waitress transformed a customer's racist remarks into a moment of connection. "I remembered the flight attendant from the Shaq story," she explained during a community meeting. "Instead of getting defensive, I shared stories about our diverse staff and their contributions to our community. That customer is now a regular who brings his family in every Sunday, and his kids are in our after-school mentoring program." The businessman's corporate training program had evolved into a global movement. Companies from Stockholm to Sydney were implementing what became known as the Dignity Protocol, a structured approach to transforming prejudice into opportunity. The results were remarkable: improved workplace satisfaction, reduced conflicts, and stronger community relationships. During a global business forum in London, he shared a powerful observation: "We often talk about return on investment in business. But what's the ROI on dignity? It's immeasurable. It's in the changed lives, the transformed relationships, the communities that grow stronger when we choose understanding over anger." The young tech entrepreneur's app had given birth to an artificial intelligence project that analyzed successful dignity moments to identify patterns of effective responses to prejudice. The AI helped train customer service representatives, teachers, and public servants in the art of transformative responses. The algorithm doesn't just look for what words were used, he explained at a tech conference. It identifies the turning points in human interaction, those precious moments when someone, like Dr. O'Neill did, chooses to lift rather than diminish. The tall teenager, now a college senior, had expanded his coding program into an international network of tech clubs focused on dignity-driven innovation. Students from different countries collaborated on projects that use technology to promote understanding and connection. During a virtual hackathon, teams created apps that helped people bridge cultural divides. The winning project was inspired by the flight incident, an augmented reality program that helped users see situations from multiple perspectives. Technology can divide us, the teenager told participants, but it can also help us stand tall together. The airline industry's transformation had influenced other transportation sectors. Bus companies, train services, and cruise lines adopted similar training programs. A cruise director shared how the principals had changed their approach to passenger conflicts. On a ship, you're together for days or weeks, she explained. Using Dr. O'Neill's approach, we've turned potential conflicts into opportunities for passengers to learn about each other's cultures. We now have guests who book reunions with people they met during what started as tense situations. Shaq's impact on education had deepened. Schools across the country implemented what they called dignity breaks, moments during the day when students practiced responding to challenging situations with grace. The results were impressive: reduced bullying, improved academic performance, and stronger school communities. A middle school principal in Detroit shared a touching story. We had a student who was being teased about his height. He was much shorter than his classmates. Instead of lashing out, he started a basketball program for elementary school kids. He told them, "Dr. O'Neill taught us that true height is measured by how you lift others up." The flight attendant who witnessed the original incident had published a book titled Lessons at Altitude: How One Flight Changed Everything. The book became required reading in customer service training programs across industries. During a book signing event, a reader shared how the story had helped her handle a difficult situation at her daughter's wedding. The groom's family was making comments about our cultural traditions, she said. Instead of letting it ruin the day, I remembered the flight story and invited them to participate in our ceremonies. By the end of the wedding, both families were dancing together. The businessman's youth centers had become models for a new type of community space, places where differences were not just acknowledged but celebrated. Centers across the country hosted dignity dinners, where people from different backgrounds shared meals and stories. During one such dinner, an elderly man stood up to share, "I was like that businessman on the plane, set in my ways, full of prejudices. Coming to these dinners has shown me that it's never too late to change. Now my grandchildren come here to learn coding from kids I might have once looked down on." The impact on professional sports continued to grow. Teams implemented what they called the O'Neill method for handling hostile away crowds or media criticism. Instead of responding with anger, athletes learned to transform these moments into opportunities for connection. A professional basketball player shared how this approach had changed his game. "I used to get rattled by racist comments from the crowd. Now I remember Dr. O'Neill's example. After games, I stay to sign autographs and talk with fans, even in the most hostile arenas. Some of my biggest supporters now are people who used to taunt me." The story had even influenced international diplomacy. During a United Nations conference, a delegate cited the flight incident as an example of how individual actions could transform relationships between communities. The UN adopted aspects of the dignity-based approach in their peacekeeping training. Research continued to show the long-term effects of choosing dignity over confrontation. A longitudinal study found that communities where dignity-based response training had been implemented showed significant improvements in social cohesion, economic cooperation, and educational outcomes. The Tech Entrepreneurs platform had collected thousands of stories of transformation. One particularly moving account came from a retail worker who had dealt with a difficult customer during the holiday season. "The customer was making assumptions about me based on my appearance. Instead of responding with anger, I shared stories about our store's community involvement. That customer now volunteers with us at our monthly food drive. 3 years after the flight that changed countless lives, Shaq found himself back on the same route from Los Angeles to New York. As he settled into his first-class seat, a flight attendant, not the same one from that memorable day, recognized him and smiled warmly. "Dr. O'Neill," she said quietly, "I just wanted you to know that we still use your story in every training session. Last month, I had a situation almost identical to yours. Because of what you taught us, I knew exactly how to handle it. That passenger now sends our crew thank you notes." As the plane reached cruising altitude, Shaq reflected on how a single moment of choosing dignity over confrontation had created ripples that continued to touch lives around the world. The businessman who had confronted him that day was now one of his closest allies in promoting understanding and transformation. That same evening, across the country, the businessman was receiving an award for corporate leadership in social change. During his acceptance speech, he held up his old watch, the one he'd worn on the flight. "This watch used to tell me time," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Now it reminds me that every minute is an opportunity to help someone else transform." Dr. O'Neill didn't just change my perspective that day, he showed me how to help others change theirs. The youth centers they had established together had become beacons of hope in communities across the nation. The tall teenager who had started the coding club was now graduating from college with honors, having developed a revolutionary app that helped people practice dignity-based responses in virtual reality scenarios. During his valedictorian speech, he shared something powerful. "People used to tell me I was too tall to be a programmer, that I should stick to basketball. Dr. O'Neill showed me that our differences aren't limitations, they're launching pads for changing how people see the world." The flight attendant who had witnessed the original incident had risen to become the head of customer experience for the airline. Under her leadership, the company had transformed its entire approach to service, focusing on what she called altitude attitude, rising above conflicts to create connections. She often began her training sessions with a simple question: what if every challenge was an invitation to lift someone higher? The results spoke for themselves. Customer satisfaction scores had reached record highs, and the airline's approach had become a model for service industries worldwide. The tech entrepreneur's platform for sharing dignity moments had evolved into a global movement. People from every corner of the world shared their stories of transformation, each one a testament to the power of choosing understanding over anger. One particularly touching story came from a teacher in a small village in India who had used the platform to document how her school transformed local attitudes about educating girls. "We didn't fight the opposition," she wrote. "Instead, like Dr. O'Neill, we invited them to be part of the solution. Now our biggest critics are our strongest supporters." Research universities had begun documenting what they called the dignity effect, the measurable impact of choosing transformative responses over confrontational ones. The data showed that communities where these principles were applied saw significant reductions in conflict and improvements in social cohesion. A prominent psychologist published a groundbreaking study showing how dignity-based responses could literally rewire the brain's reaction to prejudice. What Dr. O'Neill did instinctively that day, she explained, was actually a masterclass in neuroplasticity and social transformation. The story had even reached the halls of Congress, where it was cited during debates about national unity. A senior senator shared how the principles had helped bridge political divides in their state. "We stopped seeing differences as barriers and started seeing them as bridges waiting to be built." Professional sports teams had incorporated the lesson into their community outreach programs. Athletes were trained not just in playing their sport, but in using their platform to transform potentially negative interactions into opportunities for connection. A young basketball player who had faced racial taunts during an away game made headlines when he invited the hostile fans to join him in a community service project. "I remembered Dr. O'Neill's example," he said afterward. "Those same fans who were yelling slurs are now my partners in building a youth center." The airline scholarship program had expanded to include international exchanges, sending students around the world to learn and teach dignity-based response techniques. These dignity ambassadors helped spread the message to new communities and cultures. During a global youth summit, one of these ambassadors shared a powerful observation: dignity isn't just about how we respond to prejudice, it's about how we help others find their own capacity for transformation. Back on the flight, Shaq smiled as he read through messages on his phone. The businessman had sent him a photo from the award ceremony, standing with a diverse group of youth center graduates. "Look what you started," the message read. "One moment of dignity created a lifetime of change." As the plane began its descent into New York, a young passenger approached Shaq's seat. "My grandmother was on your flight that day," she said. "She always told me that watching you transform that situation changed how she saw the world. She passed away last year, but I'm now studying conflict resolution because of your example." The story had come full circle. What began as a moment of potential conflict in a first-class cabin had grown into a global movement of transformation. It proved that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices: the choice to respond with dignity, to lift rather than diminish, to transform rather than confront. In his final reflection on the impact of that day, Shaq shared a simple truth during a commencement speech: success isn't measured by how high you rise, but by how many people you lift up along the way. Every moment of prejudice is an opportunity to help someone else rise higher. The legacy of that flight continues to grow, touching new lives and transforming new situations every day. It stands as a testament to the power of one person's choice to respond to prejudice with dignity, and how that choice can create ripples of transformation that stretch far beyond the moment itself. As one young student wrote in an essay about the impact of the story, Dr. O'Neill showed us that true strength isn't in standing tall alone, it's in helping others stand tall with you. That's a lesson that will keep flying forward, touching new lives and transforming new hearts, one moment of dignity at a time.